Must welcome all of you to this very wonderful talk which is to be delivered by Prof. Sudipta Kaviraj. I am a Badli Kamgar at this in this textile mills language in Mumbai. When the main Kamgar is not there, the main worker is not there, I have to do the Badli Kamgar work. She has to attend some important meeting. So I have got this very pleasant duty to introduce Sudipta to you. I don't think he requires any formal introduction. Everyone knows him, but I must introduce Sudipta for several reasons. One of the reasons is that now we have great scholars coming here. We as generous audience, really as like generous audience like devotees we go and attend. But they are foreign. But Sudipta is one person who is actually enjoying this unconditional intellectual allegiance. And so, should I say that he has become an idea? He's not an identity, he's an idea. So, he goes to Hyderabad and young students just don't know him personally, only through his work. 300 people come to IFLU to listen to him. Similarly, 350 students go to his SCU to listen to him. He is not known as a person, a corporeal entity, but as an abstract idea. So you can see, Sudipta, this is not the hall. I was talking to Anupama that this hall is going to be insufficient. And which is the case. I'm sorry, we can't. You can come here and say. Do you want to come in the front and say? Okay. So this is what is. Agamben was here some time back, and you could see the crowd. I'm sorry, crowd is not the right word. So this is Sudipta, an idea. That's the introduction. But this idea is an abstract idea which is actually operating through very important text. And I will go in this hierarchy, Sudipta, you have to disagree with me. Since I have been following your writings both as a student in 77 to now. I hope he disowns me as a student. The invention of private life in Bengal is, I think, one of the very seminal texts which takes you to nuances of relationship between literature and modernity. So I would really advise you to read this book on priority, Invention of Private Life. Though I was talking to him, the title itself is little ambiguous, but no, you go into the text, you find it so engaging. Then there is a theology of trajectories of Indian state, enchantment of democracy in India, and imaginary institutions in India. Must read text. Apart from his other co-edited volumes like this Reader in Civil Society with Sunil Kilnan. And I would also advise you to look at his seminal essay on Bhudev Mukhopadhyay on reversal of Orientalism. Sudipta has been contributing to our own understanding of how to read text and how to really associate with those texts. When we do some kind of very close reading of his work, particularly on the structures of nationalist discourse or political thought in modern India, I have a temptation to suggest that somebody can do an MPhil on this particular subject as to how Sudipta very radically and deeply differ from other scholars who are working on the same subject of post-colonialism. And if it is the question of Mandal, OBC, Dalita, Adivasi women, they have no escape but to read the lines Sudipta has given. The line about how to associate with unthought of nationalist thought, the disruptive thought of all the Bahujan and the Dalit. And that clue you get singularly from his early writings, writings that took place 20 years back. The critic of the critic. And he had just written something on M.N. Roy in such a poetic fashion. Long-term rhythmic changes in social life and short-term pitfalls of judgmental life. The idea of judgment, the theory of judgment, and how communists have really committed this. And I must emphasize this, how communists over a period of time have committed this singular mistake of going into immediate judgments and making these judgments as a lifelong project, forgetting about the long-term social rhythms in our life. And these long-term social rhythms are left for the Bahujan scholars to follow. And I think Sudipta stands as a singular different voice for us. Not only me as a student who got eliminated from 77 onwards, but everybody, every successive generation really should be fascinated by his writings. And I have this trilogy, the fashion, fascination and fate. Sudipta, we require to revisit your work only to really ask, to address questions that are stuck up in fate. So, apart from, these are your contribution to our own understanding. So, I am just provoking you to really see, not simply mapping out scholarship, and this is again Sudipta's. It's very important to evaluate theory rather than telling the story of theory. There are people who tell the story of theory. Theory is not narrative, yeah. It's not fascinating. It is actually something which will give you an additional handle to look into your fate. So you can sit because others are looking at you, not me. So quickly, he started his teaching career from JNU, and then he moved to SWAS, and then to Columbia University, where he is a professor of politics and intellectual history in South Asia. He has been the visiting fellow to Berkeley University, California, and Chicago University. I am indeed very happy and privileged to introduce you and welcome you to deliver your talk. And he is talking about historicism and the study of state. Very, very important. The study of state, and I will have 1 minute or 2 minutes to comment on it after he finishes it. Thank you very much. Please welcome.
Thank you, Gopal, and I wonder whether I should thank you or not, because it's very easy to disappoint the audience after this kind of introduction. So, but I'm very happy to come back to JNU and to be able to speak to students. I'm a bit embarrassed by the turnout, because my idea was essentially to talk to students, mainly students who study the Indian state, about some questions which seem to me to be central questions of understanding the Indian state and the way we carry on in the discipline of political science. So in a certain sense you will see that what I'm going to talk about, it's not a structured lecture, would be a kind of litany of complaints against. Speak a bit more.
Can you all hear in the last?
Yeah. I think it's loud enough.
Yeah. Okay, sir.
So, it would be essentially a set of complaints against our discipline of political science as it tries to understand the question which I think should be the most important one for Indian political scientists, that is, what is the structure of power in Indian society historically, which I take to be the question of the study of the state. Now, so what I would like to do would be to introduce mainly a set of questions, going through some, initially I would make some theoretical remarks about what I mean by historicism, because I think it's very important when you are doing serious work to be reflexive about your own, not just ideological position, because I do not see that the influence of Marx or influence of some types of German historical theory as ideological, but primarily methodological, that we always think our thoughts through the thought of others. And it's very important to understand, to state first of all, what is the thought through which you think. And then after that, I would like to spend most of my time talking about the historical study of the state, because that's what I have tried to do for a very long time. And in a sense, this is a lecture, or at least some observations about a book that I have failed to write for about 3 decades. That's not entirely true in the sense that I've produced manuscripts. I think I've produced at least 2 fairly large manuscripts, which I didn't publish, because I thought that, by the time I came to the end of those manuscripts, I felt that there were some things which were absolutely crucial to the study of the Indian state, which I didn't know enough, or I hadn't actually thought of enough to understand and analyze. Now, so my basic complaint is that the standard approaches in political science in India, as it turns towards the Indian state, if you use Partha Chatterjee's language, which I think is very important for this, Partha made, he made a very general and I think very astute complaint against forms of thought which were part of Indian nationalism, and he called it derivative. We can have debates about, exactly what sense in which it is derivative, or whether it is derivative or not, or to what extent it's derivative. But I think the central thrust of the argument is extremely powerful. But I think that we shouldn't simply be content with that kind of complaint against Indian nationalism, because if we turn critically toward the kind of work that we do about Indian society and the state, I think our work is also completely derivative in some way. And which is reflected in, let's say, I'll give you 2 examples. Very often, I find that when we try to understand the Indian state, we take first of all a certain definition of the state, which is taken from Western political theory, particularly Vega, which is an important point that, when you pick up a term like state, which is unadjective, in the sense that you don't put any adjective, unqualified, you simply use the term state. Although, actually, ancient Indian philosophy has a lot of discussion about, whether single words have meanings and things like that. I don't want to get into that. But if you simply utter the word state, I think there is a kind of very highly structured, well-known, Weberian definition of the state, which is actually always constantly filled, sort of, condensed into it. There's hardly anything that you can do to take that kind of definition out of the word state, so that you have a state which is relatively more empty, and then you can go around in Indian history and try to fill it in with characteristics or features which are non-Weberian characteristics. So I think we take the concept of the state. Quite often I also find that students would, it's good that our students are very interested in theory, but I also have a lot of complaint about the way we do theory, not only at Gopal said, which has been a concern with me for a very long time, that we tell the story of theory rather than prepare students and ourselves to do theory. But quite apart from that, normally what we do is we take a structure of theory and then try to apply that, which I think is a very, very problematic concept, to Indian reality, Indian descriptive accounts and things like that. I think that means that because of the epistemic priority of that kind of theory, even the selection of the descriptive material that then ensures, that then follows from that, is also structured in a particular way. And I believe that, that is actually fundamentally wrong. And it's because of that, the political science that we produce about the Indian state is not actually very compelling political science. But I want to take you in a slightly different direction, not complain only about that. I believe, personally, that in order to understand the present, we have to look at it historically. So what does that mean? What does it mean to make this general, sort of very large theoretical point that we should look at the present as history? I think minimally it means something like that, like this. I think it's simply to think through something. The central line, if you take that as something which is contemporary. Let me give you a very simple and very immediate example. You have to take this room at this particular point, which is contemporary, because the term contemporary actually puts together com, which is simultaneous at that particular point of time, temporary. So contemporary actually means some things that exist at the same point in time. But anything that is complex, internally complex, like the state political system, or even, let me work with this example of this room. You will see that even the assemblage in this room, has a complex temporal structure, because the building might be, I suspect the building must be from 1975 or something, when I moved into JNU, into a JNU house on this campus. So I think I'm fairly accurate in thinking about that. The auditorium might be, 20 years old. Most of you would be between 20 and 25 years old. I'm very old. Gopal is slightly less old than me, etc. So the thing is that the assemblage of things and people and things here, that we have here, is an assemblage which is of a complex temporal structure. So it has a complex kind of structure of temporality. And I start with that very fundamental point that even if I try to understand, let's say, the contemporary Indian state, there are elements, for instance, if you take something like caste, right? It plays a very important role in trying to understand the Indian state or politics or something of that kind. Now, caste is something which has a very long history, right? But you must understand that when I'm saying caste has a very long history, I'm making a point which is true but trite in the sense that it's almost meaningless. Because when I say that caste has a very long history, there are at least two options between interpreting that phrase, caste has a very long history. Sometimes it's meant to suggest that caste has not changed for a very long time, right? That's the sense in which sometimes people say caste has a very long history. That is what exists now, had actually existed for hundreds of thousands of years. But the same sentence, caste has a very long history, can also mean almost the opposite of that, which means that caste has existed for a very long time. But what caste has meant, the structure of caste, the practice of caste, and these things which make caste what caste is, have actually changed significantly at different points in time, right? That can also be captured by the phrase that caste has a very long history. So, my point is that when we try to understand anything, even in the contemporary world, if it is internally complex, it is something which is simple, in the sense in which, let's say, philosophers like Descartes would use simple, which means that it simply cannot be broken up into further parts. That is simple. But the things that we study in political science, they are not simple in that sense. State is not simple, political life is not simple, institutions are not simple, social groups are not simple in that fundamental sense. So anything which is not simple and exists in time must have this kind of complex internal temporal structure. It has a complex temporality. And because of that, I think if you really want to understand that, you have to do history. So I personally believe, I suspect, partly because of the influence of Marx on the one side, and German thinkers like, say, partly a Hegelian tradition, going from Hegel to Heidegger to Gadamer, Koselleck. Schäferli was talking just now about Koselleck. There's a deep influence of that kind of historical thinking on me. And I believe I'm actually making these preliminary theoretical points because that informs the way I look into the problem of the Indian state. So, one peculiarity that I have, I suspect, in using Marx, is that I see Marx as somebody who falls fundamentally in the historical elaboration of that historicist tradition, which I think begins essentially with Vico and Hegel, particularly Hegel. And then the people who elaborate that, to my mind, crucially includes Marx, because I think Marx is somebody who has elaborated the modern understanding of history and historicity with which we work in the everyday. But then this was taken up by people like Ilkay, who is the originator of the kind of thinking which we today, in a more narrow sense, call historicism. And the other thinkers I've mentioned, for instance, Gadamer, Heidegger is a very big person in that. So what's the implication of that? The implication of that is that unlike some Marxists who influenced me very heavily when I was a student and then I taught in JNU, so Gopal was my student in JNU for some time, he might remember this, that I used to teach a course on socialist theory, which was primarily on Marx and interpretations of Marx. And my thinking was very heavily influenced by Althusser, the French Marxist philosopher. I still think Althusser's work is very important in some ways, but there is one point in which I now think that Althusser was certainly wrong. Because Althusser, in one of his famous books, Reading Capital, had a very interesting essay. I agree with part of the argument in the essay, which is primarily aimed at Gramsci, which said Marxism is not a historicism. I do not think that is true. I now firmly believe that Marxism is a historicism. And so my understanding about Marx and that tradition is that there are two things which we must never forget, methodologically and theoretically, when we try to understand anything about the historical world, which is historicity. Historicity basically means we always ask the question, where, who, these two things, where, in what space, at what point of time, and who are the agents about which we are talking. And I'll give you a very simple example of how this simple question transforms inquiry. For instance, when I was a BA student in college and doing sociology, which was one of our subjects, we had a book which started with a chapter which seemed to be a completely unobjectionable chapter on individual and society. And I had a professor who was a Marxist. He told me something which actually first drew me into this kind of critical discussion. He said that, unless you are stupid, you cannot answer that question. What is the relation between individual and society? Because you must always ask what kind of individual and what kind of society. Without that, a generic discussion about individual and society is almost an impossible discussion. So, if you think like that, then I think historicism means essentially two things. There can be two forms of historicism. The first form of historicism might be content with the first question, but I think a historicism to which I belong, which is influenced by Marx, asks two questions, not just one. The first question is that question, that is, when somebody makes a statement about something in the historical world, to try to be precise about where is it, right? And where is it also means, there are strange boundaries of temporality, in the sense that if you are thinking of Mughal India, for instance, I'll talk a little bit about Mughal India, we must also be very clear about the precise delineation of Mughal India. Because Mughal India means the presence of certain processes which are common to Mughal India, which also mean that outside the boundaries of Mughal India, those processes either would not exist, or those processes will actually become weakened as the process actually goes out of the boundaries of Mughal India and affects somebody else. So that is the first question. The second question, which is the question of structure, that is, you must always ask if what you are studying is a society which has any kind of internal inequality of power. It can be economic power, it can be cultural power. There are some Marxists who actually define power too narrowly as economic power. I do not do that. I think power is something which is a capacious term, and we should try to understand power in its different forms. We must always ask the question, what is the play of power in the kind of society that we are trying to study or understand? So this can be called, in shorthand, the study of structure, right? That individuals are not sort of existing in a society without any sort of definite relationships of hierarchy. There are definite relationships of hierarchy which allocate individuals different types of responsibilities and rewards in their life. So structure in that sense is very important. So the way I think of historicity, historicism to my mind includes the study of structure as well. But there can be historicists, for instance, there are followers of Hegel, there are followers of Heidegger, who do not see the question of structure as being so centrally linked to the problem, to the question of historicity, but I do. So this is by way of the general introduction to what I want to talk about. So when I started thinking of the Indian state, I naturally felt that one point was to try to understand what am I actually asking, what is my general question in the most general form. In the most general form, the question of the state is to understand the structure of social power in a society globally. And since I studied the modern state, to historicize that question, to ask not just what is the structure of the state like after 1947 when India becomes independent, which is how a lot of political science work starts. I thought that my concern should not be with the Indian state defined in that way, but the state defined in much more general sociological historical sense. Now, if I did that, then the question would become, what is the modern state? Did the modern state alter structures of power in Indian society? And if I ask that simple question, did it alter the structure of power in Indian society? Then I also have to ask the question, where can I date the origins of the modern state? In fact, beyond what temporal line does the state actually become? Not the modern state, but something else, a pre-modern state. So to put it very briefly, what I thought was that I could start with the question of the modern state in India after independence, but I was inexorably pushed, towards the question of the colonial state. And beyond that, if I said that the modern state is not just the state after 1947, but it's the colonial regime which gradually introduces the modern state in India. So the colonial state is an early form of the modern state. Then of course my question would have to be, what is the structure of the pre-modern state? Let me also make a very general theoretical point, but a point which is we do not address very clearly. I did not address that at all in my early work, which is that you can answer the question, what is the character of the modern state, simply one-sidedly, in the sense that you can say that these are the characteristic features of the colonial state, these are the features which are carried over. Why is it a one-sided claim? Because I'm still not giving you any picture of what the structure of power in Indian society was before the modern state came into existence, right? So it's a negative description. Negative description in the sense that it's a description of something where I'm claiming that it is not something else, but I do not have a very clear idea of what that something else was, right? This is why it's actually a one-sided description. And I do not think any one-sided description is really a historical description. I don't want to draw you into that question. That is also, to my mind, a very complex, interesting historical question. In some of my work, I make a distinction between, this relates more to European writers writing about India, including Marx. I wrote a paper long time back, I think in 83 or something, where I argued that when Marx was writing about India, he was really thinking about Europe. He was not thinking about Europe in that sense. And by that, what I meant was that there are two ways in which societies can be juxtaposed. One kind of juxtaposition can be called comparison. The other kind of juxtaposing, which is usually done much more commonly, and which normally masquerades under the name of comparison, is a different kind of activity which I call a contrast. For instance, if you take Hegel, if you take Marx, I think they sometimes talk about the Indian side, but there's so much of cognitive asymmetry between what they know about India or Persia or China. Hegel talks about all three, and what they know about Europe, right? It should not be called a comparison, because the comparison is symmetry. That is, if you know India and if you know China, then you can compare. If you only know India, you do not know anything about China, except that China is very different from India, right? Which is also a form of knowledge, but it's a very abstract kind of knowledge. Sometimes this would be called an empty concept. For instance, I'll give you an example of an empty concept. In Husserl, for instance, there's a discussion about an empty concept. I can illustrate that by a simple example I use for teaching quite often. Suppose I'm standing on this side of a field, and there is a row of houses on the other side of the field. And I describe to Gopal the third house from the left, and I say that it's a two-story house. It has 3 windows and 1 door, and the doors and windows are these colors, etc., etc. Right? So I'm describing that house through its determination, through what it really is. Right? Its features which makes that house, and no other. Now, I know when I'm making this kind of description that the house has a back, and the back would have walls, it would have probably windows and doors, etc., etc. Right? That's an abstract knowledge. It's a form of knowledge, in the sense that there cannot be a house which has only a front and not a back, right? If it's a real house. Now, but I do not have any determinate knowledge about the back of the house. So the back of the house, therefore, for me, according to this kind of theoretical thinking, is an empty concept. We use empty concepts quite often, but it's interesting that when we do that, I compare India and China, compare within quotes. But I know about India, I know very little about China, except that China is very different from me. What I'm doing is not comparing, I'm actually contrasting India with China. I want to make a certain kind of point about India, for which making a kind of very minimal description of China is required, right? But that's not a comparison. So similarly, I gradually realized that, although in my own work, I constantly said the modern state, etc., and I gradually moved historically to understand the structure of the colonial state. I discovered 2 things which then pushed my own thinking in that direction. One is, I realized that there's an interregnum in Indian history in a country where there are many other players, both indigenous players and Western players like the Dutch and the French, etc. And the British ultimately, through a fairly long period of turmoil, the British ultimately come to dominate. Right? So I felt that it led to a partly theoretical problem for me, because I found that the first part of colonial presence in India, and you should notice that I'm not using the term colonial rule in India, colonial presence in India, is a period which is marked by the existence of colonial power, undoubtedly, but not by a colonial state. There is not something which is sufficiently singular. There is not an institution into which the functions of what we call the state today, legitimately, are bundled together sufficiently closely for me to call that a state in that period. So it drew me into a theoretical problem in the sense that there can be periods in history in a way you cannot actually look for it. You look for a state, but you cannot find one, right? And that immediately raises the problem: how do you describe that? What are the concepts that you should use for non-state-like institutions, let's say? Or I've made an argument in a paper that I wrote some time back where I said that the idea that in every stage in history there would be the presence of a state in superstition. There are many phases in history. For instance, in the feudal period of European history also we find something like this, that the functions that, because of our, our positionality in history in a certain sense, because we are too familiar with the modern state, we simply see some fundamental function, to be bundled together and inextricably connected to each other, which is not historically true. There are phases in which you will find that those functions will be distributed between different types of institutions in society. And the end of the strong Mughal Empire and the rise of a strong colonial state is a period like this, which is an interregnum. And I also felt that if I wanted to claim that the modern state, which emerges with the colonial state, really affects the structure and distribution of power in Indian society, I need a much more empirically valid and empirically vivid understanding of what pre-modern, pre-colonial Indian society was. So I wanted to notice the logic of the inquiry in the sense that if you historicize your inquiry, if you follow simply that, it's a very minimal structure of a logic of inquiry, but if you follow that, it would push you, like me, towards something like this, that you go backwards and you face these problems. Now, let me talk to you very briefly about 2 issues which came up. The first one was the question of sources. when I wanted to understand what the structure of power in Indian society was before the British came, during the time or during the decline of the Mughal Empire, what are the sources that I should give? Now, I'll give you two examples of sources which are absolutely fascinating, but which also produce very important intellectual questions. And because I want political science students to take these questions seriously, and I hope that some of you at least will do better work on texts like this than my generation have done. I want to set it out a bit more fully to you. Now, I'll give you, out of the very rich literature in Persian on the Islamic side, and in Sanskrit primarily on the Hindu side. If you ask me the question, sometimes I've asked the question that, why do you say Sanskrit? Isn't Sanskrit only the high part of the culture, which is true, but it's the high part of the culture where I think more systematic forms of knowledge are lodged. And so in vernacular material and in literary texts, etc., you might get information with which you can modify the body of knowledge that you get in Shastric texts. But there is no way I think you can actually avoid looking at these Shastric texts, that is, texts of the Sanskrit structure of knowledge. Persian. I don't know Persian, so I have to depend on translations. I know Sanskrit reasonably, so I don't have to depend on translations on the Sanskrit side. But Siyar al-Mutakarim, the translation of the title is A Review of Modern Times. One of my students in Colombia who works on Islamic law, he actually gave me the Persian derivation. He said that, Mutakarim is related to the term akhir, that is the last part of something, akhir. And Mutakarim actually means those people or those times which have been the last time, that is contemporary in that sense. And Siyar actually means a review. So it's a review of modern times, review of recent times. And the book starts with the death of Aurangzeb in 1707, and it ends with the time of Warren Hastings, to whom the book is actually presented. And it's written by somebody, his name is Ghulam Hussain Tabatabai, who is a Mughal intellectual. That's why I think the book is so crucial, because it's not written by somebody who is a Western historian. It's a Mughal intellectual thinking from within the world of the intellectual world of the Mughal. And no, it's okay. I think you can hear me. Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me better now?
It was fine. It was fine. Earlier was fine.
Just okay.
I'm at privileged position, so I can't follow.
Okay.
Clear.
So, it can't improve the quality of my argument, but then you can hear me better.
Okay, sir.
So, so this book is a chronicle. There's some very interesting textual features of this book. It's a long book. The English printed edition, I think, runs into around 1,500 pages, very close print. It's a long, long chronicle. Why is it a chronicle? It's a chronicle because it's not written like a modern history. It's not structured in terms of periodization and things like that. It's just, one event after another, but recounted in great detail. And but there's also something else which is interesting about the book. It starts its history with a focus on Delhi. Then it shows the unraveling of the Mughal world, Mughal political world, and then his interest actually shifts to the east, to the creation of the Diwani, to the creation of the Nawabi of Bengal, larger Bengal, which includes Bihar, parts of Assam, almost the whole of Orissa. so the Nawabgi of Bengal, their gradual sort of declaration of independence or secession from the Mughal Imperium, the creation of a new state, and then that is the setting of the coming of British power, a new kind of power coming from thousands of miles away, which actually overwhelms the earlier society and establishes a new kind of power in space. So it's very interesting to read the book because at least I read the book, I suppose any modern reader would read the book at two different levels. One is the level of the events it recounts, right, which are interesting in themselves. But also, when we read history, we do not read only an account of events. There's always a kind of a pursuit of some kind of causal explanation about not only what happened, but why did things happen that way and no other, right? Which is a kind of some kind of a frame of an explanatory analysis. Now that analysis is not entirely absent, but it's not very strong in the book. So what you have to do is you read the book at its own level, and then you have to sort of lift yourself to another level where you give it a kind of slightly causal translation of the account of the book. And then you get the whole answer. For instance, I'll give an example of what I find very interesting in the book. So he gives the story of the decline of the Mughal Empire and the rise of the British. That's what he's trying to understand. But he's not. What is fascinating about the book is that this is a mind which does not take for granted like modern minds. It's actually quite inevitable that, if there's a conflict between a Mughal state, which is an old imperial state, and a new state like the British, armed by modern science and technology, etc., what do you expect? In fact, the new state would prevail. It's a presumption. It's not something that we explain or we account for. It's a presumption which works in our access of the descriptive account of the book. This is why the descriptive account is very interesting, because the descriptive account is not written with that assumption in mind. So every time the Mughals are defeated, there's an element of surprise, right? Because he is looking at it from a Mughal point of view. That this is actually one of the greatest empires in the world, and Aurangzeb was such an effective, important emperor. How is this happening 25 years after Aurangzeb's death? So there's a constant, sense of surprise in that. But the sense of surprise, to my mind, is not just a literary thing. I think it comes from the deep, a kind of deep supposition which we do not share about the book. And that's another interesting thing about the book. But the book ultimately also gives you an explanation, at least partial explanation. He doesn't give it in an explanatory form. It's not that there's a chapter of the book where he said, now I'm going to tell you why the Mughal Empire failed, right? So occasionally when he is talking about, let's say, the emperor doing something to the Mansabdar family, and the Mansabdar family falls into poverty or something like that, he said that it's such a pity that this political system, he doesn't use the term political system, it's such a pity that in our world, somebody who rises in the world because of military skills or political, political statecraft and things like that, there is no stability to that. In fact, the moment that man is gone, the entire wealth, goes back to the state, and other people simply have to begin from scratch in a certain sense. So if you sociologize that account, which is still a descriptive account, I think it's a powerful sociological argument, which is a very Tocqueville argument. Remember, the argument in Tocqueville that there's a big difference between France and America in terms of property. He said that in France, because of primogeniture, the whole property in aristocratic family simply goes to the firstborn, right? So the property is not divided. The property simply runs in the family. And their eminence is actually based on that kind of property continuity. In America, they don't have primogeniture. So even if I'm an extremely rich man, I have 5 children. The moment I die, my children would not actually be rich to the extent I am. So there's a very quick acquisition of property, and there's very quick parceling of property. And so therefore the accumulation of privilege that you need for the creation of a kind of historically durable ruling class, this is something which is very difficult to do in America. So this is a Tocqueville argument. But he makes an argument which is very similar to Tocqueville in that sense. He basically said that the Mughal system is such that it simply does not allow a kind of aristocratic class to stabilize and become durable, and then maintain a kind of continuity of policy. And also he sometimes suggests that it is something which is just too heavily dependent on the intellectual quality of just a single individual. So Aurangzeb was an extremely able ruler, but he is followed by people who are simply not able ruler. But the nature of power is so person-centered that if you have an incompetent person come, in fact the whole Mughal empire can be actually unraveled in 25 years. That is the great historical question that he is trying to answer. So you have this on the one side, and I also noted something else. I think it will become clearer when I make the second part of my argument. If you read this, you will find that it's a very Islamic story. In the sense that most of the people who are important figures in the story, it doesn't have the kind of quality that Sanskrit texts have. It's a historical text. So it gives you a clear impression that there's a power which is Islamic something ruling over a society which is much more complex, non-Islamic society, and there are all kinds of diversity. That it does not ignore. But because it has such a strong focus, on the ruling elite, in fact the people it's tracking are essentially people like this. But of course, because of the nature of the story, the Marathas come up from time to time, and there are interesting incidents which are recounted. On the other side, we have, if you want to understand, what, let's say, the Brahminical elite, how they are looking at the world of politics around the same time, right? I'll give an example of a book which we have to read, which is called Veera Mitrodaya. The title of the book comes from two names. Veera is the name of ruler of Ocha. Veer Singh, he is the ruler of Ocha, so he is Veera. Mitra is the name of the author. His name is Mitra Mishra. He is a Brahmin. Most probably he comes from the region around Almora. So he came to the Ocha court, and Sheldon Pollock has made this very, very interesting argument, where he says that he is one of the greatest Sanskrit scholars today. And he says that when I look at the continuity of the Dharma Shastra text, I find something which is very interesting. From the 11th, 12th century onwards, the Dharma Shastra texts, they do not decline. As I said, they do not decline in number. Sometimes they also do not decline in their expanse. But something very interesting happened. Earlier, if you look at Manusmriti, Manu Dharma Shastra, or any of the older Dharma Shastra, it's absolutely mandatory for the Dharma Shastra to have a section on Rajadharma. Right. In the middle, this is what Pollock shows, I think quite convincingly. The Rajadharma chapter gradually declines. Either they become just very, very abbreviated and perfunctory, or they disappear altogether. And it's only after the coming of Akbar that Dharma Shastra books, now produced within Mughal India, they start having chapters on the Rajadharma again. And Mitra Mishra is so interesting for Sheldon Pollock, who is a close friend of mine. It's very interesting for him because he says this is probably the largest ever compendium on Dharma produced in Sanskrit. It's the largest Sanskrit Dharma Shastra, simply in terms of just the size of the text. For me, what is more important is that the size of the Rajadharma section, because the sixth chapter, I think, is the Rajadharma chapter. It's a long, highly elaborate chapter on Rajadharma. But the important thing is, let me tell you about the question that I have out of this. That suppose in my inquiry about the Indian state, I then say that I must have a chapter in some of the book, some versions of the book that I said I failed to write. I failed in the sense that I would have 6 chapters, and then I felt that I must actually have a chapter which covers the period before this, something that I have covered more or less fully. And so if I said that let me have a chapter on Mughal India, the political world of Mughal India, and these two are my major sources, obviously I face a very big problem in the sense that there's hardly any communication between these two worlds, at least directly. And Veera Mitrodaya is also a very strange text, I think, for another reason. Because these texts, it's true not only of Viramitroda, but also many other texts. Pollock has written about it continuously, many times, and not just Pollock, others as well, that Sanskrit texts, more or less, seem to live in a completely self-enclosed world, which simply does not make any reference, to the Islamic world, which actually envelops it, surrounds it, sort of has interchanges with it, intervenes into the world of these people. So it's a very strange, cultural strategy of a certain kind. And Viramitroda is no exception. Let me also tell you a story about the Viramitroda because it's an interesting story. This man, in whose court the book was written, was a great friend of Jahangir. And he did a great service to Jahangir by murdering Abul Fadl. Abul Fadl, who was not merely Akbar's minister, but also a great friend of Akbar. He came to Eastern India for something and he was travelling back. When he was travelling through the territory of the Ocha kingdom, he was murdered. And it's generally acknowledged that he is murdered on the incitement of Jahangir. And Akbar, there's some document in which Akbar says that, if he wanted the throne, he should have killed me, so that then he could have actually got the throne much more easily, rather than killing Abul Fadl. So there's a connection between Viramitroda and the setting of the Viramitroda. It's actually in the middle of the Hindu kingdom, within the general Mughal Imperium. Right? But the very interesting thing is that, it's written in a style which is a continual style running from the Manuskriti onwards, with hardly any change in the construction style of the current country. So, coming back to the point of research, I think if we collectively want to understand that world, we need to have a discussion where, on the one side, this actually shows what political science students ought to do if they really want to do good work on the Indian state. We need to have either people who are fluent in both Persian and Sanskrit. There are people like that. In fact, we have a student of our department, her name is Auditorium. Her book has just come out. Her thesis was on Sanskrit production in the Mughal court. So she is a trained Sanskritist, but she also learned Persian because, in chronicling, when a particular text was produced in the Mughal court, quite often she didn't get much help, from the Sanskrit text themselves, because they're very, very casual about dating, ascription of authorship and things like that. But the Persian side is meticulous about these things. So it's through the Persian side that she basically dates the manuscript that she reads of Sanskrit production in the Mughal court. But what we need is either a group of people who are fluent, both in Sanskrit and Persian, or two groups of people, Sanskritists and Persianists, brought together to talk about these two worlds, which talk in two very different cosmopolitan languages, whose internal techniques of presentation, the whole cultural style is utterly different. So you need to be a scholar of that style in order to understand even what it says. And then you can have a kind of dialogue or an exchange between these two groups of people, along with people like us who are more theoretical and modern historical questions, to begin to answer this question, what is the structure of power and what is the nature of something like this state in Mughal India. Now, I mentioned just two or three other points very quickly and then stop because I basically want to discuss it. I have made this point in other contexts as well. In fact, one of the complaints I had against the Indian communists was on this question, which also has a historical form. I argued that quite often Indian communists who I think had a potentially very powerful theory of uneven development, although they abstractly talk about uneven development, quite often when they talk about real political issues, they ask about what could be the right line, what could be the correct line for the whole country. If you look at the debates among the communists in 1948 to 1951, you will find that initially they follow a line which has one understanding of what is the main contradiction or what is the correct analysis of India. taken from the work of Ramadeva. And when that failed, they shift over to an understanding what is the correct line about India, that we should have an agrarian revolution rather than a proletarian revolution, drawn from the work of some Andhra colonists. My criticism is that they are inconsistent to their own theory, because they have a very powerful theory which allows them to say that, well, India is not sufficiently single, to look for a correct line. In fact, India is so internally complex that the correct line can only be a kind of composition of lines which are correct for different regions of the country. So we should abandon the search for a correct line in that sort of general, grand sense. But I think this compositional problem, what I call the kind of compositional singleness of India, this is a question, this is a problem today, and I think this is also a problem as we go back into the past. Because, and this actually becomes one of the other major issues in trying to produce a historical understanding of the Indian state, because the further back you go into the past, you will notice something which I have partly covered in my writing, that the state doesn't have the features of a sovereign state. So I have called it a subsidiary state, a state of subsidiarity rather than a state of sovereignty, which is reflected in the fact that the state does not impose a single set of laws over the entire territory which it controls. It simply allows regions which it conquers to carry on with the laws which they had before, sometimes carry on even with the governing elite which they had before, if they pay a cess or a tax or some kind of a tribute to the empire. And the other thing is that the empire is also very short-lived usually, because the empire has constantly shifting boundaries. So it simply doesn't have the temporal opportunity of durability to establish something which is sufficiently simple. So I think the other problem in tracing the history of the state is that the further back you go, you will realize that what you can call Indian, like the Mughal state, or in South India, for instance, for some time, the state of Vijayanagara, which brings a very large territory under its control. It's not durable, it doesn't last for a very long time. And so you go back into the problem of composition of individual regional history, right? And I personally believe that if we look closely, not the memories, but the legacies of those individual regional histories, I think still exist in India. For instance, if you really want to understand the history of Maharashtra politics today, I think it's very important to see the Peshwa tradition. If you want to understand some parts of the politics in South India, I think you have to look into traditions which are historical traditions of power in South India. So I think that is another question. Let me make a couple of quick points and then conclude, because I wanted to elicit your response rather than, as I said, to give through a historical understanding or historical account of the specificity of Indian facts. You are pushed into doing something like this. So you have to devise concepts, and after devising concepts, you have to think of supporting concepts or implications of those concepts, etc. And it's not only me who does that. For instance, if you look at the work of most people who have thought about questions like this, let's say Partha Chatterjee, when he thinks about Indian democracy, he is forced to recognize that the term civil society actually simply does not work all the time. So he is forced to make a distinction between civil and political society, which is not what you will get in European theory. You get the term political society and a contrast between civil and political society there as well in Hegel and Gramsci, etc. I remember telling Partha that you should probably not use the terms civil society because it's so invested with European meaning. But he said that, well, from my youth, the context of my youth, people would understand that I'm actually using it in a very different sense. So this is one thing that we have to do. And finally, my argument would be that as we go on doing something like this, we begin to be mistrustful. There are two stages, I suppose. One is a stage in which you feel that you have come to an argument for which you do not have a ready-made language. And you have to produce concepts or name the processes that you have discerned, right? And produce some of these things to supplement what has come to you. But I think gradually, as you work on this and you systematically come across difficulties of this kind, I think you begin to be suspicious. Suspicious not in the usual sense. You begin to be suspicious about the language that that you have to use, because we cannot deny our history. I cannot deny the education that I had. It formed me intellectually. I think you are getting a similar education. Unfortunately, I think it would have been better if your education had actually given you much more entry and much more control over Indian material than I had in my education, but I don't think it has changed very much. So you have the same education, you are given a particular language through which you open up the world. But I think if you are sensitive, if you are historically minded, very soon you will come to a point where you will see that your inquiry partly militates against the language in which you are conducting that inquiry. You cannot conduct that inquiry separated from the language that you have learned, right? So we therefore develop a very peculiar relationship, with the language as singular, sort of unproblematically singular as India. In fact, even today, I think India has a kind of compositional singular. So I'm using the term compositional awkwardly. In that essay, I argue that there are three things that you can do about India. One is you can generalize on the basis of the region that you know, which is a very common Bengalis are constantly criticized, I think partly rightly, for generalizing upon the region that we know. So the whole of India actually becomes essentially a general from an understanding of empirical specificity of history that demands for theorization and demands for theoretical innovation come. So that's the third thing that we should do in the discipline of political science. So my conclusion is that we should think about the discipline fundamentally, and we should do the discipline in a completely different way. Thank you.